During his time as head of corporate development, EMEA for Google, he completed over $230 million worth of deals. He recently left, and now, according to his LinkedIn page, and I'll quote from there, he is a Zoogler doing disruptive new things in internet financing. I'd like to welcome Anil Hansjee. Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Anil, maybe we can just start with what is a Zoogler?
It's a great name, isn't it? It's an ex-Googler. I think a lot of companies who really operate well in their ecosystem understand the value of their alumni network. Often companies like McKinsey's have been quoted into totally leveraging that alumni network for the purpose of growing their business and their relationships. In the same way, I think a company like Google recognizes the power of its ecosystem, and the alumni network is part of that.
Yeah, there's some pretty powerful Zooglers out there, I'd imagine.
I've got a drinks event tonight, so I'll find out.
Excellent. On that point, why did you decide after your great tenure at Google to leave?
It was a difficult decision. 5 great years there, not only of tremendous growth in the company, but also a great learning experience for me. So it took me a long time to get to this point. But personally, I'd felt that I'd always wanted to go back to venture capital, where I came from prior to Google, and do things in a slightly, or maybe more than slightly different way.
Yeah.
And the timing was just perfect in terms of how we see the ecosystem growing today, with the emergence of some great new talent and companies and entrepreneurs, and perhaps a need to do things and think about things in venture capital at early stage differently.
Yeah. Okay, so when you say differently, as the other part of your LinkedIn profile says, you're doing some disruptive things in internet financing. So what do you think needs to be done differently, or what's your thoughts behind that?
Well, I felt there was no point really leaving Google just to do the same old thing that I'd done before Google. And of course, one of the advantages of being in Google is it encourages you to think big and think differently and think disruptive. They did that in their industry and did it very well. I figured I'd give it a go in the venture capital industry, an industry which perhaps has had less spectacular return success in Europe, and perhaps there were reasons for that. And in addition, suffered from rather large inefficiencies in the movement of capital from the supply side to the demand side. So I felt there were some opportunities to relook at how the models of venture capital work at early stage and see if I could tweak the formula a little bit.
Yeah. We're going to have a lot of entrepreneurs, Anil, watching this because obviously your position is corporate head of development for EMEA Google in your previous role. So a lot of people wanting to hear your thoughts on things. So maybe we can start with entrepreneurship. A lot of entrepreneurs out there live the dream of one day getting acquired by Google or other major corporates out there. Do you think there's anything wrong with that, starting off with that in mind?
I don't believe that you should be setting up a company specifically to flip that company, but as a natural evolution of where that company is going, if it were to have an early exit, I don't believe that's an issue at all. And in fact, I encourage that. Certainly, at my prior job, we certainly did a number of transactions. I would say that we're in the class of the sub $50 million deals, and in fact probably a majority of our transactions were at that level, and it was all about us being able to embrace external innovation. From an entrepreneur's perspective, I also think it's valuable because certainly for a first-time entrepreneur, it's a great way to get the exposure of how to build something up from the ground, and then how to exit it, how to work with the buyer. And then the plus side is you have some cash, so you're able to go further and longer and easier the next time around. So it encourages serial entrepreneurship as well. And so I think for an ecosystem as nascent, certainly in Europe, I would absolutely encourage that. And that's perhaps something we'll turn back to when we talk about venture capital, because it's often an overlooked segment of the market in venture capital.
Absolutely. In terms of the entrepreneurs out there, the right timing to come to a Google or something like that to try and get the next raise of capital, would it be after prototype is being built and then you're just looking for scale, or what's your thoughts in terms of what type of organism do you have to have created for Google to be interested potentially?
Well, firstly, speaking specifically about Google, I mean, I think they're a rare beast in the sense that they knew how to engage with companies who were at very early stages as well as later stages and everything in between, actually. But in reality, very few companies understand how to embrace external innovation and encompass that and leverage that within large corporates. So I think it's going to be a case by case in terms of who your target acquirer is and how you engage with that person in the company and the organization itself. But certainly from a Google perspective, there really wasn't an early enough time. I mean, having it on my radar screen and my colleagues' radar screen always helped, and being able to follow the progress, see certain validation points, always helped. Being able to perhaps sign a business development deal with the company so that you could strike a commercial relationship always helped. So I don't believe there is a appropriate time. In fact, it should be as early as possible, really.
Interesting, because you mentioned something earlier about sort of innovation, external innovation, and we can talk about that later as well. But from an entrepreneur's perspective, understanding why Google may acquire a company, is it very much because you're seeing it as a sort of a bet on the future in terms of they could be in something innovative that may well turn out to bear some fruit in the market?
I believe that if you're a platform company, and I would categorize Google that way, that then the strength of your platform is really a function of the strength of the players who operate on that platform and the level of traction of those companies. So I think it's actually a great validation for the platform if you have companies that are living and breathing using your APIs, for example. And so for us, or for Google rather, looking at companies that certainly leverage our platform is a great opportunity to strike business development deals, or if there's great traction in what they're doing, and Google felt that it should be part of the core, then there's a natural progression into moving it into the platform. So that certainly is a great way to engage. Clearly, also, there are other companies that perhaps doing something completely disruptive to the way Google operates within a particular area, and again, being the type of company that Google was in terms of encouraging innovation and wanting to find the best solutions, they were always interested in understanding how various other companies looked at the same space.
In terms of advice for entrepreneurs that are wanting to be acquired or raise another round of finance, any specific advice for entrepreneurs at sort of the early stage? I mean, would they should they proactively approach companies like you, or do you think that they'll just be on Google's radar if they're doing exciting things anyway, so they'd expect a phone call at one point?
There certainly is a radar as well, and actually the beauty of internet-based businesses are the metrics that actually you can pick up both inside your own company, where you have access to many more metrics, but externally as well. It's possible to see number of mentions and searches, and so there are techniques to use to find interesting trends of companies, and so they may be picked up from that perspective. But actually, I don't think there's anything that substitutes a personal relationship. And often when, if you look back at successful acquisitions, it's been built on that strength of relationship of the sponsor of the deal and the leader of the target company. So nurturing those personal relationships and is paramount. And of course, you're not going to know from day one which person to speak to. So the business development arm of Google or the corporate development arm of Google are often the natural gatekeepers or into the organization who help navigate and help find the right people within the various product areas, for example, who would be naturally a sponsor. Then it's up to the entrepreneur to nurture that relationship directly.
Got it. Okay, so the good old networking in the real world pays dividends.
It does, and I think actually that sort of comes as part of the ecosystem in California, and perhaps it's been a little harder in Europe for us to replicate that kind of natural sort of coffee shop networking, and so we've had to be more proactive in Europe, in terms of outreach, but also entrepreneurs also need to be more proactive too.
Yeah.
So I think there's more to be done in order to smooth that link between corporate engagement with early stage companies. And unfortunately, it still has a predominance of being US tech companies who understand better how to engage, and there aren't enough European corporates who really have enough outreach programs or external innovation programs.
Right.
It's changing gradually. And the things that you're seeing in, for example, Tech City in London, some of the initiatives there are really encouraging around how corporates are engaging with the community there.
Yeah. What's Tech City in London?
It's sort of the buzzword of the area around Old Street and Shoreditch, where there's a tremendous amount of exciting, new, innovative entrepreneurs starting their businesses.
Yeah. So going out there, networking, doing some warm handshakes, actually meeting people, and then, because it's interesting, because there's some private equity firms out there, or venture capital firms, that say, don't send us a business plan, come through somebody we know or a mutual acquaintance. It just shows the power of the network that entrepreneurs build. It's very important. It's
the same principle, really. However, a handshake is not enough. I mean, I think clearly getting exposed is great, one thing, but you have to have something to back that up with, and that you really have to focus on what are the key validation steps that you're trying to show, whether it's a venture capitalist or whether it's the corporate. What is it that you've done that perhaps is relevant to the person you're speaking to or impressive in some way? It could be as simple as the team that you've put together, all the way up to the breakthroughs you've had in terms of user traction or something like that. And so it doesn't always have to be revenue related, clearly, but certain validation steps are clearly needed in order to make the impression.
Got it. So now let's just say somebody's met you, and as you said, it's not just about the handshake. What tips would you give to an entrepreneur? And like, for example, how would you know you're speaking to somebody you would actually want to follow up with, as opposed to no thank you? What tips would you give on that sort of early stage interaction with somebody like you to make sure they can set an impression? What would you be looking for?
Somebody who really has given a lot of thought into the audience that they're speaking to. I witnessed this a lot at Google because it's a platform company, because it's all embracing in the internet and plays such an important role as the sort of the first exposure to the internet that somebody sees on their search engine page. The assumption was that Google will be doing everything and anything, and therefore they must clearly be interested in my company. And so not having done the homework as to why Google may be interested in this or why not, and just making that assumption was often the first sort of factor that put me off following up. When somebody had really clearly given thought to where it fitted in, and how it fitted in, and why it was different to what we were doing, or why it could take us in a different direction, that was enough of a sort of teaser to then want to explore internally. So I would then take that proposition or that thought internally and find out, is it true what this entrepreneur is saying about this space, unless I had already picked that up from prior conversations. And if there were some interesting overlaps, I could then follow up.
So we've talked about sort of what to do when you first meet when you first meet somebody like yourself in that powerful position, and obviously researching why there could be a value and what's a value proposition for the potential acquirer makes a lot of sense. Let's just say now you've taken it to the next level and you've invited them to come and give a pitch. What advice would you give to entrepreneurs about making a pitch that really sticks and works?
The same advice, really, if they're talking to myself or a venture capitalist, really. Really practice your presentation is the obvious. It's so obvious, but actually, it's undervalued as a piece of advice. I mean, get it down to 30 minutes max, because there will be questions, there will be intro time. Really understand what is the elevator pitch that you can leave them with, and be prepared to understand your audience again. So this is the next phase. So really know who's turning up. Are there engineers there? In which case you may want to think about focusing much more on your technology platform and how it's built and why it's different. Are there business people there? In which case, you may want to focus on what the business model is, or how you are going to move into a business model. So understanding your audience, number one, and really practicing the presentation in front of others and getting it down to an elevator pitch. Those are probably the two key takeaways. And actually, there's a third one, and I see it quite a lot. Don't make an assumption that you're living in a vacuum, and there's more than likely to be 10 other companies doing something similar to you. And especially in the current age where startup costs have dropped dramatically in terms of what you can do with a little bit of money. There are many solutions out there in the market that look like Me Too, and it could be a first mover advantage. So really try and position yourself as to how you're different or why you're different, so that you don't get the question, well, what about company X, Y, and Z, and look blank.
So if you get questions, make sure you know your presentation one layer deeper than your presentation. So if you get questions on that area as well,
that's a good way to cut it down to 30 minutes, absolutely. So, don't necessarily have all the slides that answer all the questions. Have them in the appendix if you can bring them up.
What would you say are some of the trends of the most successful entrepreneurs that would get investment that you're looking for? Is it the people, the team? I know it's a cliche, but
it is.
Does it have to be both?
But it is.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I think the answer is different depending on who's giving the answer. Yeah. So I guess for an investor, the perfect entrepreneur is someone who's done their shareholders good and made a great return and probably is going to do it again. Yeah. For a user of the product, a consumer, if you like, a great entrepreneur is someone who's changed the rules, rethought the rules, dared to take a chance and made my experience better or improved in some way. And I guess for an operator or a team member in your company, the good entrepreneur is someone who knows how to take a vision and actually execute on it.
Yeah. If we can talk about corporate development now and innovation within corporates, what advice would you give, Anil, to a CEO of a business that wants to really innovate through acquisitions? I mean, because you did it right. I'm sure there were some mistakes and some successes, but overall, Google is very, very well known, also here in the EMEA specifically, about doing the right acquisitions and also then making sure that they live and breathe well under the parent company. So what advice would you give to a CEO that wants to innovate through acquisitions but do it well?
I think you hit the nail on the head, really. It's understanding that there's life after you've signed the documents. The integration aspect is one of the hardest to achieve. I remember in my days before I was venture capitalist, I was a banker, and many of the M&A deals that we did, we had this line item called synergy. I never knew what the synergy was until I was at Google doing on the buy side. Right. So it is really about. I mean, it may not be a synergy aspect, but it is really about the integration. It is about finding the person internally who is going to be more than just a mentor, but actually is your key sponsor, and keeping that relationship strong, because that person is the person that got the deal approved alongside the corp dev team, but that's the person who is really going to help you be able to execute the plan that was behind the reason we brought the company in. Okay. So nurture that relationship, make sure there's a real clear bonding between the two people, the leader of the target and the sponsor. That sponsor could be the CEO, him or herself, but often in smaller acquisitions, it's a product director, a product vice president, an engineering director, an engineering vice president. Yeah. And understand very clearly what some of the milestones are up front, but be very aware that in fast-moving companies, strategies can change, and so don't get hung up about the market moving to the right or to the left. Being adaptable to that, having a focus perhaps more on the longer term aim and how you navigate there may change over time, post the conversations that you had prior to the acquisition. And then I would also say really understand and hammer home why it was you decided to be acquired versus try and execute on your vision alone. And that often is all about the resources that you can leverage as part of the larger entity. And that can be as simple as manpower resources. More often it's much more complicated than that, and it could be around traffic, it could be around huge data reserves and mining of data, manipulation of data, and being able to observe different trends and use those trends in different ways. So really focus in on what it was that drove you to wanting to be acquired beyond the capital, of course.
Sure, yeah, exactly. Now that makes a lot of sense, because there's a lot of infrastructure and scale that you can get through the parent organization. For other corporate development people that are watching, I mean, you are head of corporate development for EMEA for Google. You can't get much better. What advice would you give to other corporate dev guys out there that their CEO is really wanting to drive acquisitions, but how overall, 2 or 3 pieces of advice for corp dev guys that want to make sure that they do the acquisition trail well?
Yeah, so I would say that you need to nurture the internal relationships just as much as you're nurturing the external, because you're really the person that is going to bring all the bricks together, finding the product sponsor or the engineering sponsor or the business sponsor, helping them understand how to position the acquisition within the context of build versus buy, or other alternatives, helping them pitch it to the acquisition committee, and helping them build the right kind of incentive program for the people so that the people stay, helping them build the right type of operating plan for post-merger synergies, and ensuring that the internal people understand that there is a process involved, and there's a proper amount of due diligence. It takes a proper amount of time, so it isn't always a quick fix.
Yeah.
So I think that it is really about understanding that you do have a very strong internally focused role, as well as the point about finding great talent outside or great ideas outside. It's equally important internally to make sure that you've paved the way or set up the right infrastructure so that acquisition will work and all the expectations are aligned.
Good advice. So good old internal communications as well. Can't beat it.
More than communications, but yeah.
That's right. Let's talk about innovation for a second. What's the whole debate versus innovation, build and buy? A lot of entrepreneurs don't want to go to Google with the idea, was they think, well, they've got the resources just to buy it. What do you think about CEOs going through innovation through external acquisition versus just making sure they've got great R&D and building internally?
I don't think it's an either or. As evidence at Google as well, there were many cases of acquire that had really impactful end results. Android is a great example. All of the Maps business at Google is a great example. The analytics business transformed the ads business of Google, and that was another acquisition. So I don't think it's an either or. It can come down to having, do you have the right expertise in-house? Is it a matter of needing to move a little faster? Is there a market leader already? So I think there are a number of sort of questions that you need to sort of address before deciding on what's the best path. I think given infinite resources and infinite time, good engineering companies, and it's not just Google, but will always be able to do that. And speaking as an ex-engineer, I always thought that, I can do anything I want. I can build anything I want, and that will remain the case. This is why you hire these people, because they're great engineers. But that is only one dimension of the decision process. So I think laying it out in that context around all the parameters, as opposed to just the assumption that you have enough time and resources, really hammers home a decision around do you build or buy. Clearly, these kind of things are hard to do in the small companies. When there's a market leader position, it tends to be, do you want to be in this area? Is it strategically important for you? If so, let's get the market leader.
Yeah, but some of those companies, just going back to the culture and implementation again, some companies have done very badly. Like, for example, let's take Bebo and MySpace, obviously huge huge exits for the entrepreneur, and then the value has diminished significantly over just a short space of time. What advice would you give for a company that's acquiring a business from the sort of maybe even incorporating them, making sure they include the founder, the original visionary? Any tips there on?
Well, I mean, absolutely. I don't think Google did any deals. You can't quote me on that, but I don't think they did any deals without ensuring that there was really strong incentive around the founding team. Because ultimately that's the most important asset, despite all of the other aspects, a great product, great IP, great market position. It's really the team. So you always focus on the team. And indeed, some of the smaller deals that Google did were really fairly and squarely focused in and around, if we bring a leader in of this caliber, he or she can execute amazingly, even outside of the shell that he or she has built in another context. And I think that's played itself through. I remember a statistic before I left Google, and it may have changed slightly now, but it was something in the region of 70-80% of founder CEOs of companies that Google had acquired were still with the firm.
Wow.
And you have great, case studies like Andy Rubin from Android that went from building a fantastic small product with an 8-person team to suddenly becoming actually a key part of the leadership and decision-making team at Google.
Yeah, because Google seems to know, all great companies seem to know it's all about the people, so you're acquiring the talent as well.
It's always a key component. So beyond the talent, I clearly do believe that you need to be focused in on the reasons that you're buying. So, you mentioned a couple of examples of Bebo and MySpace. It's funny because actually when the MySpace deal was done originally, a lot of people thought that was a fantastic acquisition. So it was really only because the asset declined in value, and the same for Bebo, that people now look back in hindsight and say, well, perhaps it wasn't a fantastic acquisition or shareholder value. So really, what that amounts to is more one of timing issues. Knowing when in the cycle you're buying, and if you're buying for the reasons of wanting to participate in a sector such as social networking, then understand that everything comes in cycles. And so if you're only leveraging, wanting to leverage the benefits of social networking, then you have to make sure you understand how to stay on top of that cycle at all times. And so when the market shifts to a different type of social networking, such as Facebook, you either have to be a first mover there because you understand the sector, or you have to sell the asset earlier. So I think that's more of just understanding technology cycles and the reason you're buying. If, on the other hand, they had bought those assets for the people or some core IP in there, you could still argue, despite the external decline of those social networks, that the acquirers would have definitely got something out of it. So we don't know the full story at all times.
Yeah, I know you mentioned that you're an engineer also in the background, and we're talking about innovation. So we've mentioned about innovation through acquisition. If we can focus on innovation internally now, which Google obviously is great at too. Google's well known for having, I think, allowing its engineers to have 20% of their time on, non-project work. In other words, just things that come. Do you think that approach to innovation, allowing everybody just to focus on things like that, is right, or do you think innovation has got to be targeted through an innovation and R&D team in the more traditional way? What's your thought?
So I haven't had experience of the latter. So it's hard to comment. All I know is that the former worked exceptionally well at Google, and it probably isn't just a slam dunk to replicate that, but there were certain characteristics in the culture that enabled them to execute well on that 20% time. And I think it started first and foremost with the founders themselves displaying the type of entrepreneurship characteristics that were role models for any engineer coming in. So it's always great to have case studies, and even better if you have internal case studies. So that helped. Then the fact that they set an incredibly ambitious vision statement, mission statement, one which both was a quest in a way for anyone coming in, but also was broad enough to allow people to interpret that in many different ways. So, trying to organize the world's information, clearly the interpretation that was executed on first was around search, but actually, funny enough, things like driverless cars also fits into that, in the sense that it's using an amazing amount of real-time data that it's picking up, interpreting that, and trying to feed that back into driving a car in a safer, more efficient way. So I think it does start with the founders themselves as role models, the mission statement they set. The bar is high, it's ambitious, but it's also enabling, it's broad enough for people to interpret that in a way so that if you give them 20% time, they are, in a sort of roundabout way, all driving towards that mission statement. But they're interpreting the path towards that in their own way, or what the projects they're working on are aligned to that mission statement. But they're including various wacky projects like driverless cars.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think a lot of companies would be afraid that the 20% downturn just turns into an extended lunch break.
Well, exactly. So I mean, a lot of that is because they've set this amazing mission statement, which encourages people. And inspires people, but gives them the freedom to operate within within that umbrella, and leveraging the resources of the firm to achieve that.
Great. Is there 2 or 3 things you think, and I'm sure it's quite hard to nail it into such a concise thing, but 2 or 3 things that you think that Google do exceptionally well that have enabled them to go so far?
Hire great people, give them the freedom to execute within the boundaries of quite an ambitious and all-encompassing mission statement, and not be afraid of failure, as long as you understand why you failed and how you can reuse that in a new way. So those would be the 3, and those 3 things apply to any company really, any ambitious startup too.
Yeah. How does a company, because you mentioned talent a lot during this interview so far, and it is, as you said, all about talent, but how does in Google's terms, how does Google prevent Zooglers, and how does companies make sure that they can actually retain great people as well? Because it's
yes, I mean, I don't think Google assumes that everyone would stay there for all their career. I mean, the companies change simply by growing. The culture changes. The impact that you can have can change. Maybe the business models might change, or the focus areas might change. So there's always a natural evolution, and certain people like certain types of stages, certain types of risks, and certain types of challenges. So there's always a natural attrition rate. The key thing is you do your best to not lose the people you want to keep at the right points in their career. And I think clearly, equity involvement absolutely helps. But also having a great work environment, and being trusted, and having the freedom to execute. And 20% time fits into that. And smart people attract smart people. Engineers like to work around smart people. And having amazing data center resources, crunching data, is something that is rare to find outside of universities, perhaps, or IBM or something like that.
Right.
So
yeah.
I think there are lots of ingredients that help the incentivization program, not just your standard kind of salary.
Yeah.
But then the recognition that actually when they do become Zooglers, that they nurture that alumni network, and this is going back to your first question. And so keeping the connection with alum, to understand what they're doing and how they can be actually, if they're building a business, how can that business fit into the ecosystem that Google is trying to build around itself.
Yeah, because Google, as you said, hires some of the smartest people in the world. But I suppose when people cash in on their equity, I suppose there's as you said, smart people hire smart people there, but people are going to want to be working for a company that's sort of seen as number one. And so I suppose there's a pressure for a company like Google, who's reached the top of their industry, to make sure that they maintain being in that position.
Well, this is the constant threat represented by the innovator's dilemma, Clayton Christensen. We all know the theory, and one of the hardest things for a large company is to keep refreshing itself. it sort of helps when you have a fantastic cash cow that you can use. But some of the new projects that Google have invested in have really started to pay off. And the mobile phone, Android, is a great example. The geo web is another. The stuff that they're going to do on enterprise and local will be future potential billion-dollar businesses. And so I think it is a great idea to have a core, but then continually understand how you need to invest in products, projects outside of that core. Over time, those projects may come into the core, but that also aligns itself well with enabling people to do 20% projects, which typically are sort of more esoteric, or it aligns itself quite nicely with acquisitions, where sometimes it's hard to acquire a company that is so critical to the core of the business, so search, because of the difficulties of finding something as good, or the difficulties of integrating it. But perhaps if you acquire interesting businesses that are orthogonal to search in some way, but cover a new area, then one day they may migrate into the core and support the core and make that core strengthen.
Yeah.
I think there was a saying that Larry had that I think he broke down his projects 70-20-10 in terms of how time was spent, 70% on the core, 20% on near core things that could evolve into the core, and 10% on wild and wacky stuff. And I would probably I would hazard a guess that acquisitions were in the inverse proportion. So perhaps 70% of acquisitions were probably outside the core, just to sort of support that continual flow of innovation.
Great. You mentioned The Innovation Dilemma by Clayton Christensen. For those who haven't read that, and we should all go and read it, but just in a nutshell, what's The Innovation Dilemma?
It's some of the challenges of how large companies keep themselves fresh against the sort of, I guess, the continual disruption that happens and you see it especially in the technology industry because of the fast-moving nature of that industry. So company names that used to be household names that are no longer around. The question is why, and how do you respond as a large company? And often looking at solutions like, do you set up a separate subsidiary? Do you acquire? How do you encourage your large companies to continue to innovate and refreshen themselves?
So you were talking earlier about cycles. Do you think that all companies need to represent just understand there is a cycle, and it will be at the top one day and then it's going to go down? Like Apple, for example, it's certainly been around for a long time, but it's now one of the coolest companies in the world, no question about it. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean, companies can have multiple cycle peaks, but I do believe. I mean, I think you see it. You see it more clearly in the tech industry because of the speed of innovation that happens in that industry. But recognizing, as a venture capitalist, you also have to recognize that cycle because you have to time your entry and exit points to optimize your returns.
I suppose, as you mentioned, if you're a large corporate or you're a VC, you've got to somehow, there's something about predicting what's going to be coming up in the future and aligning maybe that 10% or 20% with what's coming up in the future to make sure you're nailing a trend early. Any advice for a VC or a CEO, corp dev guy that wants to make sure that they have some prediction?
Well, I have my crystal ball in here, and I'm not going to...
I'll buy that off
That's my secret weapon. Actually, I think that, again, using Google as an example, and Eric Schmidt speaks about this a lot, is how you recognize what are the fundamental technology changes that are driving your industry, which clearly are the underpinnings of those waves that I spoke about, those cycles that I spoke about. But so, for example, storage cost, latency, speed of networks which drive latency, sizes of components or semiconductor sizes, Moore's law driving some of those changes, and understanding your business in the context of that. So if you're making an investment in a company that you're likely to have want to support for a multiple year period. You don't really want to be focusing on what's achievable today with today's technology. You actually want to be making a bet on where those technology trends are going to be in 5 years' time, so that you hit the nail beautifully. Now, sometimes you can get that prediction wrong, more often than not. Shazam is a great example of that, a company I invested in at IDG Ventures, where quite clearly the vision of being a music recognition in everyone's pocket was born when the smartphone was born. Even though the company was launched many, many years beforehand, we had that technology vision. It just took longer to get there than we originally thought. But now, with over 100 million downloads, and I don't follow the latest numbers, but they're doing phenomenally well. So understanding what technology trends you're riding. Personally, I believe the business models that many VCs are so focused on finding today will actually evolve at the point in time where your product becomes meaningful in that technology, in that new technology world. So things, business models such as virtual goods and software as a service subscription and freemium models only came about because of the technology enablers that repurpose those companies in a new light. So there is a tendency to focus on what is the model. Today, the model may be one thing, or you may not have a model. I guarantee it'll be very different once your product hits the right technology sweet spot.
So it's like putting a bet on the future, and as you said, it's not necessarily about the adoption, because a lot of people say, show me the adoption, but then presumably if you've come up with an idea that is ready in, let's say, 12, 24, 36 months down the track, it wouldn't have adoption at that point when you're talking.
No, and this is the perennial challenge of early stage investing. The need to, or the desire by an investor to see some validation points before putting money on the table, and the frustration of an entrepreneur needing the money to execute. Going back to your original question around the inefficiencies of the supply and demand of capital, that hits the problem square on the head. It's a little easier when you're a growth investor and you're investing on incremental improvements or expansion or consolidation. So taking the business model and expanding it, it's very difficult to get the bet right when you're an early stage investor.
Yeah, I know you mentioned Eric Schmidt earlier. He's done very, very well with Google, obviously, during his time as CEO. Now he's obviously chairman. But is there anything, just from you being in the same company, that you've learned from Eric Schmidt specifically that you think you could share with some of our viewers about success as a CEO, or the sort of leadership lessons we can learn from Eric?
That's a great question. I think my observations were that he knew how to gel with the founders. And so, yes, he was the CEO, but he also knew that this was still very much a founder-driven company, both in terms of who they were represented internally and externally, and in terms of where many of the great ideas and execution plans came from. So the ability to gel with and I would extend the analogy to your team, was a critical success factor for Eric. Knowing how you complement them as opposed to try and drive them or replace them or point them in directions. So allowing them to do what they're good at, but complementing them with a new set of skills that they perhaps didn't have. And clearly, from Eric's perspective, I mean, he probably had many more things than I can think of here, but some of the things that I could think of were clearly, he's been around and seen a lot of these cycles, and knowing when might be a good time to double the bet on this particular product or slow down on this particular product, given his worldly experience in the tech industry, I'm sure was valuable. And secondly, really understanding how that you can innovate, but you never really innovate within a vacuum. There is an ecosystem. There are partners. There are competitors. There are businesses that are paying your bills. There are businesses you're disrupting. How to engage with those companies in a very diplomatic way, always emphasizing the win-win, building the right kind of partnerships. He was very eloquent and capable, and still is in doing that.
Do you think that Larry Page is, because very often the founder comes in and is taken over by the chief executive, do you think that partnership is a strong one, where you've got the founder as the CEO and the chairman now who's got the
Well, they've been together for a long, long time. So I think the proof is in the pudding. Yeah. So obviously Larry will want to, and has started already, to impose his own style. I think it's great that a founder can come back in as a CEO. Often the accusation is that CEOs, they're good at a certain part of the company's growth cycle. I think it's hats off to Larry, because he observed how Eric ran the company for many years and has obviously learned a tremendous amount from that, and now he has felt that he has grown as an individual, I would imagine, and stepping back in at a different stage of the company.
Great.
And judging from the results that were released not too long ago, he's not doing too badly.
Yeah, because Howard Schultz came back into Starbucks and Steve Jobs at Apple, as you said.
Yeah, sometimes a little differently. In those situations, there was a little bit of a sort of quote-unquote rescue need, and that clearly wasn't the case here. So you can sort of understand that going back to a founder can be a shareholder reaction, because you want to go back to your roots, or you've decided that the company's needs a bit more of the sort of spiritual guidance. That wasn't really the case here.
Okay, great. So on Eric Schmidt, it's making sure that you allow your team to really sort of build on their strengths and make their weaknesses irrelevant, and sort of the experience that he has and the intuition.
From my own perspective, as in leadership roles, the thing I learned very, very early on is that there are people who are smarter than you out there. You give them the right platform, the guidance and the motivation and the incentives to execute, and the goals, right? Aligning the goals. Yeah. Then it doesn't matter that there are smarter people out there. So always trying to encourage those attributes in individuals, and don't get hung up about trying to create hierarchical structures and whipping people into certain directions.
Yeah, let's elaborate on that if we can, because you're a leader in your own right. So is there sort of 2 or 3 key leadership principles that you would live by? Somebody who's just come into a leadership position, for example, that hasn't got the time to go and read the billions of leadership books out there, but just wants to learn from Anil on what is it that makes a great leader.
I'm no expert on that. I'm sure there are many different interviewers that you could find, but my own experience is I think there are many different leadership styles. There are dictatorial styles, you name it, and they can all have success. The one that suits me is more of a collaborative approach, where you recognize that actually people do a good job. So if you give them the right environment to do that job well, they'll execute on it. So your job as a leader is to find the right kind of people, and set them the right challenging goals, and incentivize them, and build a team, and that that collaboration of a team, magic should happen. Clearly, it doesn't always happen, and so the fine tuning and tinkering is also part of that leadership role.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a really good assumption to have, that people want to come to work and do well. And if you've got that, it's a very positive mindset. There's one question I'm going to kill myself for not asking you, and that, sure. I'd love to squeeze that in, and that's just about Groupon. People think that the founders of Groupon turning down Google on a huge offer that would have made them all very, very wealthy, for the hope of getting an IPO later, would make them even more wealthy. Do you think that was do you have any comments on that decision? Because people think that they are mad, and just want to get your thought.
So I'm not privy to the thought process on Google, on the Groupon side at all. I think you always have to take your hats off to people who ultimately are still more ambitious. The company was still a young company. Yeah, I mean, everyone assumed that it had been around for a while because of its many millions of or hundreds of millions of revenue. But actually, it was a very young company, and so I'm sure the fire still burnt within the team to execute. I think it's going to be a hindsight. The answer to your question will be a classic hindsight one, because we won't know until a number of years from now as to whether the model is really long-term sustainable, and therefore whether or not it was the right decision. And I think. I'm sure Groupon recognize that as well. So what they have to do, I'm sure, is to focus in on things like how do you prove that you have long-term value for your customer merchants rather than just sort of one-off trips, and how do you optimize the ROI for the merchants, and how do you also create the best experience for your consumers so it doesn't come across as spam, it's better targeted, and it doesn't sell something that isn't there. So, but these almost seem like fine-tuning of what effectively is a fantastic business that they've created.
Anil, you've given us some phenomenal wisdom, and if we can, and so thank you for that. If we can, though, let's go back to the introduction when I said that you're a Zoogler doing disruptive things in internet financing. So, and talk about sort of the venture capital world, etc. So, can you tell me? Let's elaborate on that, and just tell me what do you think is potentially lacking in the VC space, if anything, at the moment?
So it comes to back to some points that we were discussing earlier. That fundamentally there is a difficulty of assessing risk at early stage, and the business of venture capital is about risk assessment and putting capital behind risky projects, but at the appropriate level of risk to get a certain level of return that their investors expect for them. So there's a natural bias in that model to, of course, only want to back the future Skypes, Spotifys, and Wongas and Badoos of the world. The question is, which of these many hundreds of startups will evolve into that? And at early stages, it's incredibly difficult to assess that. There are techniques, and active fund managers in venture capital are good at picking up certain trigger points in and around, for example, the quality of the team. Has the person done that before? Do they have some IP which is truly disruptive? There are many trigger points, but in general, it is incredibly difficult. The earlier you go, a company is more represented by the optionality or the option value that exists, as opposed to the enterprise value that exists. So asking an entrepreneur to validate themselves, their model, through perhaps revenues or partnerships at the earlier stage is incredibly difficult, and it gets a chicken and egg situation where they need the capital to achieve that. So I think what is lacking is a better mechanism for putting risk capital at play at early stages, number one, in a more transparent and effective way, because ultimately a CEO running around for 6 months looking for seed funding for a 2, 3, 4 man and a dog company is incredibly value destroying. And ultimately, even the transaction cost element and due diligence cost element, it takes as long to do a small transaction as it does a large transaction, can cut significant points of IRR of return from the small company stages as well. And secondly, it's all about trying to bring in new sources of capital to the early stage as well, because there is quite clearly a commoditization of capital. It's just not being applied to early stage company generation, mainly because the people that sit on this capital and typically invested in, let's say, property or bonds or equity or even late stage private equity, family offices, high net worth individuals that typically aren't engaging with the early stage seed community, are applying their capital elsewhere, mainly because they don't have mechanisms at play or understandings of how to pick and choose stocks. So clearly they would love to be part of a tier one venture capital fund that does that for them on an active management basis. But there is a limited number, and especially in Europe, the points I'm making are more acute. There are a limited number of those type of funds. So having better mechanisms for the flow of capital from these sources to early stages, and then having better mechanisms of dealing with the clear idiosyncratic risk that exists in picking stocks at early stage, are two things that I think need to be addressed at early stage in order to make that market more efficient. And that's really where my model is focused on.
Excellent. And your model, what's the umbrella? Is that a new fund that you're setting up?
I am raising a new fund with partners, and we all, back to your leadership question before, your team question, we all bring different aspects to play: entrepreneurial skills, operational skills, investment skills, financing skills, different networks to play in different geographies as well. So we're a team that I think are a crack team who are putting together a proposal for various family offices to invest in the asset class that is seed technology, internet investing, as opposed to investing in specific individual stocks. So we are trying to create a more liquid fund for asset class investing early stage, which brings more capital to the market, more entrepreneurial startups funded, and then that platform will enable later stage VCs to make better and more finely tuned judgments as to which companies have which validation steps, because we will apply real functional help for these companies at early stages to show the validation points.
Right. Okay. Interesting. So your contacts within the VC community to then potentially exit to VC or other corp dev guys would be potentially very beneficial to those entrepreneurs as well that come in at early stage with you.
Absolutely. One of the functional value add components that we will bring outside of the usual ones that you might think of, help in UI design, help in product design, help in architecture, help in marketing, help in recruitment, help in cash flow management. These are functional skill sets which we can bring to the table and which many startups don't have and don't need to have in-house at early stages. One of the other ones is clearly the business development, corporate connections, and exit help at the appropriate points in time. But the investing team members bring that set of expertise.
Excellent, excellent. If we can talk about, because I'm sure there's going to be entrepreneurs clamoring to get within your umbrella because of the expertise that your leadership team have and also the potential access to the capital. But let's get back to the spotting or reducing the risk at early stage, because inherently, early stage capital, you get a bigger chunk of the business, so therefore it could be more beneficial for an investor, higher risk, but potentially much sweeter returns at the exit. But how can you? Is there any way that you can actually reduce the risk?
Yeah, so I believe there are certain people who have fantastic networks and proprietary deal flow and that will make better stock picking decisions. There are also people who are just plain lucky. My proposition, however, to a new class of investors who typically don't engage with early stage is to say, well, you can get into a top tier fund if you can, but that is a limited supply of capital need in there. As they get bigger, these funds, they also want to invest larger chunks and therefore go later. So it doesn't really help the early stage community. So my proposition is, let's take out of the equation the luck element, let's take out of the equation the stock picking element, and offer them a platform to invest in the asset class itself, as opposed to the particular stocks. And so the theory behind that, in how do you reduce risk in a portfolio, is diversification. And so it comes down to classic portfolio theory, where you need a significant number of deals to prove that you have a significantly diversified portfolio, so that you're capturing the market risk premium without taking on the idiosyncratic risk that is involved in particular stock picking. Okay. The challenges of that particular model are not so much the theory, but the challenges are how do you build a portfolio that's big enough, and therefore, as a consequence, how do you add value at scale to all of these companies? And that's where some of the secret sauce that and the learnings from Google that I observed and my team members bring critical skills and insights to, and that's really what we're trying to do.
That sounds phenomenal. So would angel investors, they'd be potentially a source of money for your new fund because they don't have to invest in one or two and manage themselves. They can put the money through you and get early stage exposure without the, as you said, the individual stock picking.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. High net worth individuals, family offices could do. So we are not at the stage right now where we are officially fundraising. Because we're stress testing a lot of our theory, but we're very close to doing that.
The time of this interview is July the 21st, 2011. It may well change, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you could also imagine that individuals who want to manage their own investments and not invest in a fund could also just simply invest on a side-by-side basis. You could also imagine venture capitalists wanting to invest into the fund as a deal flow generation, as long as it also returns profits. So there are many sources of the capital. I think, this discussion has been good because it is important to emphasize that building a fund, you always have to remember where the capital comes from. But one should also not forget who one's customers are. And my customers are the entrepreneurs. And so my objective is to bring fresh new capital to this sector so that many of the entrepreneurs that don't get funded by the tier one VCs because they just, at that point in time, haven't been able to demonstrate an enterprise value or validation points, are more likely to be funded by us and therefore have a path to those validation points. So we are trying to bring and make the whole process of fundraising much smoother, much faster, much more transparent. And I think that's ultimately what will be the winning, the success factor comes always from remembering who your customers are. We don't exist without the entrepreneurs around us.
Sounds like some of your secret sauce you're beginning to get into. Anil, I just want to say thank you very much indeed for everything you've shared with us today. It's been really great. Thank you for your time.
Pleasure.
And great seeing you. Thank you, Anil.